The promise of a 360-degree customer view is tantalizing, and the emergence of identity resolution services appeared to bridge this divide. However, as with many solutions in the nascent stages of evolving digital landscapes, there are nuances that need addressing. For example, how it's priced. A predominant pricing model in the identity resolution sector is the per record fee. On the surface, this seems straightforward. Businesses pay based on the volume of records they wish to consolidate. However, this model poses challenges for larger enterprise with vast data sets. The costs quickly escalate, making it a less feasible option for continuous integration or for businesses that experience frequent inflows of new customer data. Another example is where the data is processed. One of the fundamental requirements of many identity resolution services is the sharing of customer data externally with the vendor. This has raised eyebrows for many reasons. Data security. So sharing sensitive customer data externally always carries inherent risks, even if vendors employ top-tier security measures. Customer privacy. With global regulations like GDPR and CCPA, businesses are under scrutiny about how they handle and share customer data. Transferring such data to third parties can complicate compliance efforts. Customer approval. Long agreements are being splashed in the face of customers, allowing the organization to do whatever they want with their data. Now, corporations know that people don't read it, so they make egregious demands that can easily demonize the organization if they're ever surfaced publicly. Now, because of this, engaging with identity resolution vendors is not a simple handshake agreement. Contracts are notoriously intricate, reflecting the complexity of services and the sensitivity of the data involved. These agreements often encompass stringent data handling clauses, performance metrics, and intricate pricing structures. Such complexity can be a deterrent, especially for smaller businesses with limited legal resources. And given the sensitive nature of the data being handled, all the potential ramifications of data breaches or mismanagement, vendors often arm themselves with extensive liability insurance. This not only indicates the perceived risk in the industry, but also adds an overhead cost which inevitably trickles down to the client in some form. Now, another issue, especially for those that value real-time or near real-time insights, is the processing time for matches. Most vendors process every 24 hours. This latency can hinder businesses that require quicker turnaround times for actionable insights, especially in industries where timely personalization is key to customer engagement. This doesn't even mention the time to get data through pipelines to bring it back in-house. But they do work. With all their faults, the identity resolution vendors have been able to accomplish something that many master data management or MDM tools on the market often fail to accomplish. They work. The matching is high, and they're able to provide an enriched view of the customer despite all the duplicate versions of that persona being sent to the vendor. Now, only 5 years ago, they appeared to be the only option that actually did work consistently. But today their model is cornering them into a very tight niche within organizations. This containment to just the immediate customer attributes and nowhere else is due to some of the drawbacks we've mentioned earlier. For example, if the pricing metric for matching is on a per record basis, then how likely is it that the organization will incorporate their transaction data or their clickstream data? How viable will it be for near real time if, say, an external pipeline needs to be established, or say an SLA time frame of the engine itself is 24 hours? And then if the legal framework for engagement is so complex, how likely will the organization be prone to use it for high-scale matching events like credit card hash data or call center transfers? Now, most identity resolution vendors would scoff at these questions, just saying that once the identity crosswalk has been established, the rest is just making sure you can establish internal joins. But in the real world, establishing this kind of touchpoint stitching on remote identifiers is far more complicated and extensive to query manually. Customer touchpoints are omnipresent within an enterprise. Purchases, interactions, clicks, calls, emails, etc., all leave a tapestry of loose data elements. Rarely do these data elements come in pristine overlapping attributes that are easily stitched together. Rather, they appear in varied levels of loose coupling across semantic categories in the data. One database might have a loyalty number and a credit card hash, and the other might just have a credit card hash and a transaction amount. Well, customers that are part of a loyalty program often traverse organizations anonymously, despite having their status in place. So stitching their anonymous purchases can be very helpful for showing their actual buying frequency and recency. But notice that in this case, we're focusing on the transactions and interactions themselves, not just the customer master data. If you ask an identity resolution vendor to stitch the transaction and interaction data together, they'll have stars in their eyes thinking of their next bonus check. This is because transactions, interactions, and clicks, etc., are very high record count data stores. This simply leaves organizations unable to answer basic questions about their own customers and their activity. Not because they don't have the data, but because they haven't been able to tie that data together without an enormous monetary and logistical burden. So how do we get there? Now, it turns out there's some ingredients for touchpoint stitching. So let's talk about them. If we're going to address all the issues stated in this white paper, we're going to need to start with the processing location. After all, if we're not sending our customer data to a third party, we're going to need to process it internally. So we need a platform that is expandable enough, both in terms of storage and in terms of compute. Now, the computation of matching records is a mathematical problem. The function looks like this: number of records times, parentheses, number of records minus 1 over 2. So if we took, say, 10 million records, that would compute to almost 50 trillion comparisons. Now, if we're talking about a ham-handed comparison algorithm, the cost to run would be completely out of reach for most systems. But even with a highly optimized compute strategy, it's still a large computation problem when you get to big data sets. So whatever platform gets used, it has to be able to scale without a fuss. Now, on the storage front, part of the solution for making the processing possible is the ability to temporarily expand and collapse storage. Additionally, the value of touchpoint stitching is in the capacity to acquire data from an unlimited number of records from all the systems being stitched. So both in-memory and long-term storage have to scale without a fuss. Now let's talk about some licensing ingredients. It might seem impossible to have a company not charge a per record rate, but that impression is usually related to the presumption that the service provider is incurring compute costs. What if the raw compute costs weren't charged by the service provider, but rather by the cloud data store directly to the customer, and the solution was simply an app on that cloud data store? Such a program would allow far more flexible licensing to the customer, such as a fixed annual fee without an attachment to the data itself. The cloud data store's compute costs would then be an important point of interest, so the service must be highly tuned. Now let's talk about some security ingredients. Cloud service providers have to draft extensive legal agreements with outlandish 400-question surveys about the provider's security protocols. But this is largely due to the fact that the service provider is housing or accessing the customer's data. But what if the service provider had no access to the customer data? What if the solution was simply an app which worked natively on the cloud database, which had already been vetted by the cloud provider? Such an arrangement completely changes both the risk and the ethics of exploring the customer data, as nothing is being provided to outside parties, and the data being analyzed is based on interactions with themselves. Let's talk about some matching ingredients. Touchpoint stitching isn't just about customer records. It can encompass any type of data to centralize it around any domain of interest. This means that the solution needs to allow for any kind of data to be added and weighted for matching. These could be custom fields that are specific to the enterprise or common to external data sets. After all, if the enterprise is going to tie a product, customer, asset, device, transaction, etc., it can't be constrained to a predefined set of semantic categories. This also means that matching has to be flexible enough to identify relationships that might be distant, perhaps even generations of pair matches apart. This is especially true for things like clickstream data, where the matching of a session might be based on a very scant amount of correlated evidence. So let's talk about a case study for Touchpoint Stitching. One of Truelty's partners had a complex challenge they needed to solve with one of their existing clients. The client was attempting to tie clickstream data to customers that were browsing, purchasing, managing, and executing their insurance policies. Of course, these functions span multiple systems, but the largest set was in their clickstream data. This represented many billions of records. The queries being used to try to tie this together were taking way too long and costing way too much. Every day, the hand-coded matching query was ran, and the processing cost for each run was roughly $12,000 in Snowflake compute. Now, running simple math over the course of a year, that adds up to around $4,380,000 just for one daily query. This amount was considered completely unsustainable. So using Truelty's Touchpoint Stitching in Snowflake, the query costs were dramatically reduced down to roughly $12 a day and took about 5 minutes to complete. This meant that the stitching could be done intraday, allowing downstream business processes to leverage the up-to-date information. Snowflake provides a very capable compute platform for doing such complex high-scale matching events, but to make that processing feasible, the approach has to be completely turned on its head compared to how most skilled data engineers would approach the problem. This is why it is so capable at the task of touchpoint stitching. So let's talk a little bit about Truelty's engine. It might not be a surprise that Truelty has all the ingredients mentioned in this white paper, with one exception. The Snowflake native app architecture is in the works. Once Snowflake releases some of the needed V2 elements, Truelty will fully transfer to Snowflake native apps architecture. Today, Truelty is deployed as code within the customer's own Snowflake instance. This doesn't change any of the core tenets of data security or privacy, as the data is not shared with Truelty, as the execution is all still locally conducted. So if you want to learn more about how the Truelty engine works, click on the Get a Demo icon in the top right of the Truelty website. It's at www.truelty.com. And we hope to see you there.